Welcome to Some Weekly Review, a weekly program where we explore media through the ages. Today we're talking about old school video games, specifically the Nintendo 64. Perhaps many of you out there have played your fair share of the 64, with games like Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and GoldenEye sucking hundreds of gaming hours out of you. You may also know the Nintendo 64 as the system that drove away the company's third-party support into the arms of the Sony PlayStation due to their continued use of cartridges. Well, despair no longer, friends, because I am here to tell you that there are still some hidden gems to be discovered on this old cartridge player, and we're going to be discussing just a few of them today. 5 to be specific. Well, plus 3 sequels, so technically 8. I base this list off 2 things: gameplay and obscurity. I can personally let you know that I took all of the standard factors into account, and I truly find these games I'm about to share with you fun to play. So if you're hoping to dust off your Nintendo 64 and dive into some new adventures, then I'm here to help. So without further ado, let's jump into the list of 5 seriously underrated Nintendo 64 games. Chameleon Twist and Chameleon Twist 2. If there's one genre the late 90s was never short of, it was 3D platformers, mainly inspired by Super Mario 64 and the plethora of amazing rare titles. And at first glance, Chameleon Twist might seem like just another run-of-the-mill platformer, but I'm happy to say that there's more going on beneath the surface. The first thing you might notice is that the graphics are very primitive, with an extremely low polygon count. This might annoy some players, but I find a kind of charm in it. As far as the audio department is concerned, I'd call it good, but mediocre. The soundtrack is fun and pleasant enough to listen to while playing the game, but it's nothing to write home about. There's also a lot of stock sound effects used in the game's overall sound design, but again, don't let this deter you. The game follows a very traditional linear 3D platforming model, but the gameplay mechanics are what make it so unique. You control one of 4 chameleons, who, after diving into a weird potion made by the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, have taken more humanoid forms. Yeah, the story here is weird. The fun and unique gameplay elements revolve around various platforming challenges that can only be passed by using your chameleon tongue in special ways. This can include swinging yourself around a pivot point, vaulting up with your tongue as a spring, or swallowing enemies into your mouth and shooting them out like Yoshi would. While the levels are very basic and generic in concept, they are actually really fun to play through. The biggest criticism of the game, which I wholly agree with, is that it's way too easy and too short. With little practice, you can beat the entire game in less than 2 hours. Played it a couple of times, you'll eventually fly through the levels and beat it in less than an hour, easily. Just approach the game knowing this fact. As for its sequel, it's honestly just more of the same. The visuals are slightly better, but are very simplistic, and the music and storyline are virtually identical. The only new mechanic is a parasol that lets you glide at certain parts of the game. It's a fun new mechanic, but like I said, it's the only one. The same criticism still remains too. The game is just as easy and just as short as the original. If you liked the first one, definitely try out the second one though. All of the platforming goodness from the first is there. Just know that you're going to be done playing in the same amount of time you could have watched a movie, maybe even less. So, while arguably the weakest on this list due to its problems, Chameleon Twist and Chameleon Twist 2 offer some great platforming and unique problem-solving mechanics. Jump in and check them out. Snowboard Kids and Snowboard Kids 2. You might be familiar with 1080-degree snowboarding, but Snowboard Kids is a lot more than just a cartoonish version of this classic downhill snowboarder. While most kart racers got overshadowed by the giants that were Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing, Snowboard Kids still managed to find a decent following upon its release. This is the main reason for its being on the lower end of my list. It actually sold really well. But even if it's less obscure than the other titles I'll be talking about today, it's still underappreciated in my opinion. Snowboard Kids plays very much like a kart racer, with the ability to collect items that help you get ahead in each race. One really cool idea about this game is that you have to collect coins, which are scattered along the track, or do tricks in order to earn enough currency to collect those items. It's not like most other racers where you get items for free by just running into them. Snowboard Kids actually has a lot of very unique elements that set it apart from the rest. Firstly, there's the ski lift, simultaneously the best and worst part of the game. To determine laps, every time you reach the bottom of the slope, you return to the top via a ski lift. However, the entrance to it can only take one person at a time. If you touch the ski lift even 1 second after somebody has already occupied it, you'll crash as if you hit an obstacle, which takes time to get up from, and then sometimes people that were originally behind you will use the ski lift again before you can get back to it. This is really annoying in single player, but in multiplayer, it's hilarious. Nabbing the ski lift to your friend's Fury is the same kind of satisfaction as stealing a star from them in Mario Party. The track design is also fantastic. Some levels aren't even snow related, which adds a lot of variety in what could have just been a bunch of different white slopes. Each one feels unique and thought out. Sometimes you'll be on a planet full of animals, then maybe back to a traditional snowy slope, and then before you know it, you're underwater. Plus, the visuals and audio are great too. The game looks fairly decent for an early 64 title. It kind of reminds me of the comic book Bone by Jeff Smith, and the music is downright amazing. Snowboard Kids might win the award for most criminally underrated OST. There's also unlockables and alternative game modes which add a lot of replayability. Snowboard Kids 2, which came out a couple of years after the first, is a great sequel, in that it's more of the same with slight graphical and gameplay improvements and a lot more content. This time there's more tracks, more playable characters, different game modes, 3 unlockable characters, and a ton more unlockables for your snowboard. Plus, we get more of that awesome music. If you liked the first, definitely check out the sequel as well. If you love kart racers, or you're looking for a great multiplayer game for your next party with friends, maybe ditch the games you've played over and over again and give Snowboard Kids a try. I think you'll find it's worth your while. Glover. Ah, Glover. Another 3D platformer that fell into obscurity under the weight of Super Mario 64. Glover is not the best game on this list by any means, but it is a very solid puzzle platformer that is unique in a lot of ways. Glover is not a Nintendo 64 exclusive, being also released on the PlayStation and Windows. The problem was that the PS1 and PC versions were critically panned, while the Nintendo 64 version received mixed to positive reviews, making it the truest version of Glover that should be experienced. It's a shame that faulty ports and general obscurity buried this game. It's really fun and almost had a sequel. Almost. But that's a story for another time. As for gameplay, the game isn't primarily action-oriented like Mario, Banjo-Kazooie, or Spyro, which is why many fans of the platformer genre didn't immediately fall in love with it. It's much more puzzle-oriented, but I would argue that this is why the game is so awesome and stands out from the rest. If you approach the game with the right mindset and prepare yourself to experience a slower-paced, less action-oriented game, you're gonna have a great time. The puzzles are truly challenging, and the ball in its many forms and its interactions with Glover make for some problem solving I haven't seen done this well in quite a while. The ball isn't just Glover's weapon, it's equally as important as him. It's more like an extension of the player's body. And if collectathons aren't your thing, don't worry, there's only one collectible and they aren't super important. And while I love me a good collectathon, you're talking to someone who thinks Donkey Kong 64 is a great game. This means that all the effort was put into the platforming and puzzles, even if the story and characters can also sometimes be a victim of this choice. If you come at it ready to solve some unique puzzles, I think you'll agree that Glover is a winner. Mission Impossible. Mission Impossible was released in 1998, 2 years after the movie starring Tom Cruise first premiered. Ocean, the company developing the 1998 title, originally planned for the game to be on the SNES, complete with Tom Cruise's likeness, and hype for the game was massive. The game went through production hell, however, being delayed twice, and premiering after 3 years of production. By this time, Tom Cruise had decided that video games were evil and bad for children, so he refused to let his likeness be used. This resulted in Ethan Hunt's character model looking nothing like Cruise, so instead of following the story to a T, Ocean decided to use specific sections of the movie and tie them together with their own storyline. For starters, the game looks okay. The game was heavily criticized for having a very short draw distance and a lot of fogging, but I honestly don't mind it. The game looks comparable to most 3D shooters of the late 90s, and if you approach it understanding its limitations, it's a lot less noticeable than I'm sure it was when it first released. The sound is also fantastic in this game. The music is phenomenal, and we actually get the Mission Impossible theme at the beginning. It's honestly sad that it's a big deal that a movie-based game has its theme song, but that's the world we live in. There's also some really satisfying voice acting throughout. As far as the gameplay is concerned, I had a lot of fun with this one. The game is separated into 5 missions, which, when broken down, make for 20 total levels. The game's espionage tactics are satisfying, even if a bit limiting. All the cool gadgets are there, you put on disguises, and you feel like a spy. The game can even notice when you act suspiciously or do something wrong. Even punching the wrong NPC, even if you successfully knock them out, or doing actions in the wrong order can result in a failed mission. This is really entertaining, but it can also create a tedium of trial and error after a little while. The game was also heavily criticized for its poor aiming and slow frame rate, which can make your reactions seem laggy, but it was never present enough to ruin the gaming experience for me. Figuring out how to complete the missions is really fun. You could shoot up a bunch of enemies to clear a path, hide, put on a disguise, and get away with the NPCs none the wiser, or you could change into the disguise first and not kill anybody. It's totally up to you. It has its faults for sure. For one, the difficulty is a total roller coaster instead of a gradual climb. Some parts are way too easy, others seemingly impossible. Get it? Because it's Mission Impossible. But that still doesn't change the fact the entire game is fun to play. The game even has 2 difficulty settings, possible and impossible, to add some replayability. Unfortunately, these problems combined with the massive hype led to many people being disappointed. And with GoldenEye releasing 2 years prior and Perfect Dark around the corner, Mission Impossible fell into obscurity. But I hope I've convinced some of you to check it out. If you like GoldenEye, give this one a shot. I'm sure you'll like it more than you'd think. Mystical Ninja starring Goemon and Goemon's Great Adventure. Ganbare Goemon is a franchise that is loosely based on the Japanese Robin Hood of legend Ishikawa Goemon. It's not very surprising that the Ganbare Goemon franchise has seen minimal success in the West. It's completely unapologetic in its Japanese-ness, but that, my friends, is why it's so dang special. The franchise reaches all the way back to the early arcades and the Famicom, but unfortunately only 4 titles were ever released in North America. The franchise seemed like it might have found a permanent Western home on the Nintendo 64, but sadly, Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, the first of the 2 64 titles, only sold 50,000 units. Still, its sequel, Goemon's Great Adventure, also found its way to our shores, unfortunately also to limited success, and thus the Ganbare Goemon series returned to Japan, never to return, leaving the English translations to fall into obscurity. But it's time I help bring these games out of hibernation, because there's a lot going on here. The first game, Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, released in 1997, and is a 3D platformer with RPG-esque elements. The game looks pretty decent, and the audio is good, though not spectacular. The music is great, but it's often repetitive, with multiple areas having the same music track repeated over and over. A little more variety here would have been nice. I do have to say though, the cinematic cutscenes are fantastic, and remind me of games like Banjo-Kazooie. As for the story and gameplay, both get an A+ from me. The game's platforming, boss battles, and RPG-style elements such as talking to NPCs are really satisfying. Many people note that the game bears a striking resemblance to Zelda Ocarina of Time. I would say this game is kind of like if Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time had a very, very Japanese baby. The levels and characters are superb, and the writing is hilarious. The games in this franchise are definitely comedies. I mean, just look at how these characters walk and talk. The only downside to this, which I'm sure also is a part of the reason why Western gamers didn't immediately fall in love with this series, is because a lot of the humor is Japanese specific and gets completely lost in translation. Some of the largest being when the antagonist named Danson won't stop calling Goemon Fernandez, or when some of the more sexually lewd content needed to be censored out to be more appropriate for Western audiences, which made the jokes left in their place have zero context and make no sense whatsoever. The characters feel great though. Like I said, each feels unique and you can easily swap between them with a click of a button. Each character has his or her own powers and items that help you progress through the game. The dungeons are fun and challenging, and the themes are really funny. The one big gripe you'll hear most reviewers complain about, and I'll join that party, is that there's no way to directly control the camera. You just have to stand idle and wait for it to center behind your character. And in certain platforming or combat segments, just standing around simply isn't possible. It's by and large the biggest flaw in the game, but I wouldn't consider it game-breaking by any means. Plus, there's these awesome segments where you can hop into a giant robot named Impact and fight other robots from the viewpoint of the cockpit. Who doesn't love a good kaiju fight? The game's sequel, Goemon's Great Adventure, is just as good as the first, though this time the game is a lot harder. The game ditches the semi-open world exploration and instead gives us a more traditional side-scrolling platformer. This one feels very similar to Donkey Kong Country specifically. The game is just as brutal as Donkey Kong, as you get a very small health bar with minimal opportunities to replenish it. You cannot mess up if you want to make it through the end of the level, which results in a lot of trial and error, which can be frustrating at times. The game is two-player though, so you and a friend can work together to make it through. Just as in the first game, players can also easily swap between the protagonists with the click of a button. The game is far from perfect, but thankfully the comedy is still there. The characters from Mystical Ninja return, but this time the plot is even crazier. I won't spoil it for you, but know it's crazy and involves resurrecting the dead. I personally think I enjoyed the first one more than this, mainly due to the extreme difficulty and my personal bias towards adventure games, but I do have to admit that the game over screen might just swing Goemon's Great Adventure into my favor. Either way, if you can push past the glaring cultural differences and poorly designed cameras, I would say both of these games are absolutely worth picking up. Happy ninjaing! And there we have it, 5 seriously underrated Nintendo 64 games. I hope I've helped you discover a couple of new titles to explore. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. We upload new list videos and video essays all about nostalgic TV shows, retro gaming, and more every week. And if you want some more Top Tower, try checking out last week's episode of Some Weekly Review, where I discuss some of TV's most popular shows that have somehow gone missing. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Silence, signing out. I'll see you next time for Some Weekly Review.